This is the Ring of Honor, a.k.a. Shane T, boy, the baddest champion you ever seen, boy.
This is Mr. Anderson.
This is good old JR Jim Ross, and you are listening.
You're listening to Knockouts and 3 Counts.
Cover! We got it from their world champion!
That might be one of the craziest knockouts I've ever seen in my life.
Knockouts and 3 Counts is the podcast, baby! It's the real deal, baby!
Knockouts and 3 Counts starts now.
Ooh, what up, though? It is another Thursday. This is Knockouts and 3 Counts, and something tells me that tonight's episode is going to be too sweet, but we'll get to that in a second. We've got the debut of our guy, Marc Raimondi. We got to talk about, say hello to the bad guys, but first, let's say hello to Mark first. Appreciate your time, brother, man.
What is going on, my guys? How's everything?
Hey, man, it ain't too bad of a time for us to be Detroit sports fans. I know you rock with the Falcons, but it's still let's go Lions in this bitch.
Well, look. I mean, I don't rock with the Falcons. I cover the Falcons. I'm not a fan of the team. I am an objective observer, objective journalist. But I am actually very tired from minicamp this week. 2 days in a row in like the Atlanta heat. It feels like it's already training camp. It was like 85 plus degrees this week in Atlanta, and I was out there at minicamp, and I'm sunburned, and I am tired, boys. So apologies.
Well, you got to give us the report, man. How were the Falcons looking headed into the NFL season before we get into talking about some wrestling?
You know, it's funny. They didn't really give us a whole lot as far as practice at minicamp. We got to see the like 4th string and like 3rd string guys pretty much during minicamp. We did not get any like live 11-on-11 stuff from the starters or really the 2nd string guys. So we didn't get to see Penix out there with the first team. We didn't get to see Kirk Cousins out there with the 2nd team. We did speak to those guys, but we did not actually see them in action, unfortunately. But I think the Falcons could be decent this year, but it depends on Penix. If he can be as good as they think he is or as good as they believe he can be, they could be a playoff team in 2025, I would say.
Okay, well, you leaned into one of the questions. Shout out to Devin, one of our original 4. He's got a few questions for you, but you led right into something he wanted to ask. So he told me to ask you, how do you feel about your thoughts on the Kirk Cousins pickup for the Falcons, bro?
Well, I mean, the pickup was last year. Now there's like the fallout from the pickup, right?
Yeah.
So, he's going to be the backup. And if there were opportunities there for them to have moved him, they probably would have taken them. Unfortunately, there's just no team right now that really needs a starting quarterback. And he wants to be a starter. That's he has a no trade clause. So he's not going to okay any trade to any team that does not need him. Exactly. So, the Cleveland Browns, they're kind of in flux with their quarterback situation. They have a lot of quarterbacks. It's a very busy quarterback room, but they don't have a lot of like, hey, this is my guy for the long term type of guys potentially. Maybe Shedeur Sanders is that guy. We'll see. And then once Aaron Rodgers signed with the Pittsburgh Steelers a few days ago, that took the Steelers out of the play, for Cousins. So right now it's like the Falcons are waiting to see if maybe someone goes down with an injury in training camp or even during the season before the trade deadline, and then they can move Kirk Cousins. But it would not shock me at this point if Kirk Cousins is just a Falcon for the rest of 2025.
So you led into okay. I know we're not talking football, but you also just brought up
we can
something
talk
else.
football.
Hey, I'm just happy football's coming. Like, it's around the corner,
That fucking
dude.
part, dude.
I got my fantasy boards.
I just need them to lower some of them Lions prices. They're starting to look like WWE prices, but
yeah, hey, that's what happens when you have a good football team, bro. We just don't know that.
Hey, I'm just happy we've been
alive.
Right? I'm happy we got Hutch back. We're gonna just take that into the season, and that's a win. Let's keep Hutch healthy, and our defense will be a problem. But since we talked about, since you mentioned Shedeur Sanders, man, since you get to cover the sport a lot more closer than we do, what were your thoughts on the way the draft ended up unfolding for him? Because headed into that draft, dude, like the way the Giants brought him out for that second, like open workout, like right before the Columbine too, I'm like, there's no fucking way that this guy doesn't go in the top 5. And no, not only did he not go in the top 5, like when he just kept falling down the way, I'm like, why the fuck does he keep falling? Like, I mean, I get it. I've heard people say they think it's because of like the Dion thing, but dude,
I don't know. I started to feel bad for the guy to the point where I'm like, dude, this is fucking crazy.
Yeah, they babyfaced him. They babyfaced Shedeur Sanders during the draft because originally it was almost like, okay, they're making a statement. They're kind of putting him in his place, so to speak, because of some of the stuff that might have gone on during the interviews, the pre-draft process, and what have you. But after like the third, the second, third round passes, and all of a sudden
Right.
we're into the third day of the draft,
Yeah.
and the guy still has not gone. Then it was almost like, oh man, I feel bad for this kid because he has the talent. I mean, he's a first round talent, or at least a second round talent. Certainly one of the first 2 days of the draft, and then the prank calls, which was crazy because. We're watching the draft in the media room in Georgia, at the Falcons facility, and we're hearing about these prank calls, and we're seeing Shedeur Sanders not getting taken, and then we find out a day later that the prank calls actually came from the son of the Falcons defensive coordinator, Jack Ulbrich.
Horrible,
and
man.
I had to cover that story, when that all came down. So just a crazy my second straight crazy draft weekend, because the first draft weekend with the Falcons was Penix. Just weeks after they signed Kirk Cousins to $100 million guaranteed, they take Michael Penix Jr. at number 8, a quarterback. So the Falcons that kept me on my toes. I know that I covered MMA for 11 years, combat sports for 11 years, and it's chaotic, as you guys know. But the Falcons have done a pretty good job keeping me on my toes over the last year.
I can see that,
man.
dude.
Love it.
We rock with all the sports around here. I'm loving how the
actually,
Tigers
if
are
I'm
looking
reading
right
that
now
right,
too.
Shadeur's knocking on the door to have that starting job already, according to what I'm reading. He's already like.
I mean,
two.
who is it going to be? I mean, Flacco, is he the answer? I mean, Dylan Gabriel. I mean, he's got to be Shedeur Sanders, I think, right? I mean, maybe Flacco in the beginning, and then he gives way to Shedeur Sanders. But I mean, it's a weird room. Kenny Pickett is not a bad quarterback either. I don't know.
He's just got small hands, according to the world.
I mean, look.
Dude, like I said, that one was just bizarre to me because, like, watching that went down in the draft, I'm like, damn, who did they piss off? Because this kid went from being like the number one, like
price tag, that's for sure,
dude. I know, but shit, like,
kid's got a lot to prove, and I think he's gonna. To be honest,
I was gonna say, dude, the Browns might fuck around and get them a gem real quick because he's got a point to prove.
Yeah.
The funny thing is, though, is that they took a quarterback before him. He wasn't even the top quarterback off the board on his own team because they took Gabriel. But I do think he will have actually a good NFL career. I do.
Same.
I'm with it, bro. But all right, now we got to get to the wrestling side of things. I'm gonna have to ask you a couple of MMA things too, but we'll save that.
That's fine.
But let's talk about wrestling, man. Tell me. Obviously, you got the book that's out now. I've read through the first couple chapters so far, like what I've read so far. And I grew up a kid right in the middle of the Attitude Era and stuff like that. But for you, where does the wrestling journey start for you? And then what was your first exposure to the NWO?
Yeah, I mean, my first memory of being a fan, and I don't actually remember like how I became a fan. I know that my grandfather was a bit of a fan, so it's possibly from him. But my first memories of being a fan was Hogan versus Warrior, WrestleMania in 1990, WrestleMania 6, Toronto, and just watching like the lead up to that match and being a big Ultimate Warrior fan for whatever reason in 1990 and wanting him to beat Hulk Hogan, and then he did, which was pretty fun, for a kid of I think I was 5. But that was my first exposure to wrestling, and that's how I became, a really big fan of it right in that time period. And it all kind of snowballed from there. And then I was obsessed with it. I was just addicted, and I watched everything. And then I would get all the magazines. Like anytime I found like a wrestling magazine at like the bodega down the street or a bookstore or anything, I would grab the magazine. And like the Walgreens or the Rite Aid, they would have magazines there, growing up in Queens, New York. And that's when I was learning about, that's how I would learn about different kinds of wrestling, not just WWF. And that's how I probably ended up watching WCW on TBS, on WCW Saturday Night, and some of their I remember watching like their morning programs. I have like vague memories of like watching like probably WCW Worldwide. I remember like Big Josh wrestling on a Saturday morning, like Matt Bourne, and I was very young, but I was just like, if wrestling was on, I wanted to consume it. Like I was really like, I was looking for it as much as I possibly could. And that's really where it all started. Just as a kid, very young, in Queens, and just trying to get my hands on as much wrestling stuff as possible, action figures, the car. I have WCW cars. I actually still have them. Some they're actually around here somewhere from 1991. WCW cards, trading cards, and that was my life. Like when I was a kid, like that was just what I did.
That's cool,
dude.
man.
I was the same way, man. Like it was. I think the first thing I saw wrestling wise was The Undertaker, and it was I want to say it's either 97 or 98. I would have been 5 or 6 at the time. And then when NWO come out, I remember the slogan that WCW had back then, "Oh, this is where the big boys play," and all that stuff. And like, in reading through the first couple chapters of your book too, it's crazy. Like when you think about, when we'll get into that in a second, but like when you look at the NWO and how it was actually formed, like there were so many things that happened like in the formation of that if one little thing would have went the other way, it could have looked totally different. From the fact that Hogan was on the fence at first to come into WCW, and then you had Sting was rumored to be the third guy if it wasn't going to be Hogan, and Sting ended up in there at some point and then ended up being the biggest hero for WCW at the same time. So it's so crazy to think of like how many different ways the NWO could have went. But what with the NWO made you say that this is the right thing to write a book about? Because I got to say, I mean, the NWO really kind of sparked the Attitude Era in a lot of ways. But what made you say, okay, not only am I a fan of this, but I want to go and I want to write a book about this? Because you put a lot of time into it. I've been reading through it so far, dude, and that takes a lot of brain power.
So it's actually a crazy story, and I'm glad you asked me about this because it was not actually initially my idea to write this book. I know that's going to come as a surprise to people, but the way that it all played out was I write for ESPN, right? ESPN.com. I work for ESPN, and for many years I covered combat sports, and that included WWE. ESPN does a little bit of pro wrestling content, and I was the main guy at that time doing that stuff at ESPN. And in 2019, the NWO got inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame, right? And that's when it was announced in 2019, and I was assigned that article. And WWE hooked me up with interviews with Kevin Nash and Hulk Hogan. I interviewed them, wrote probably a little bit too long of an article about the NWO. It could have been a very quick, easy, news story. Hey, they're going to the Hall of Fame, right? But it meant something to me because I was, 11 when NWO started, and it was, a formative period of my life that I remember vividly. The Monday Night War and the NWO kicking it off, and how into it I was. So I overwrote that story completely. Like I probably wrote like 2,000 words, and I had a lot of stuff in there about how much the NWO impacted wrestling and culture. So and that was it. At that time period, that was 2019. I wrote that article. I went up on ESPN.com. It got published, and that was it. I moved on with my life covering the UFC mainly. And then in 2021, in May of 2021, I'm sitting in a hotel room in Houston, Texas, and I'm there for a UFC fight card pay-per-view. It was Michael Chandler versus Charles Oliveira, that fight card in Houston. And I'm sitting in the hotel room. I think the press conference was later that afternoon. I'm sitting in there working on my laptop, and I get an email. And the email is allegedly from someone who says they're an editor at Simon & Schuster, which is one of the biggest publishers in the world. And this alleged editor is asking me if I want to write a book about the NWO. And the first thing that I thought was, this is a scam. This is not real. They're going to steal my social security number, and they're probably, maybe it's like a Nigerian prince. I don't know what this scam is. Phishing, whatever. But it's not, there's no way this is real. As I sit there, in my hotel. So I Google this editor's name, and it turns out it was a real person. It was a legit editor at Simon & Schuster, and they wanted me to write this book because of that article that I wrote about the NWO for ESPN.com. I talked to that editor. His name is Yadan Israel. I spoke to him that day, And right away we hit it off, and right away we really connected on, just the influence of wrestling on culture and how important that time period was. How big the NWO was for that time period, how that was the catalyst for the boom period in the 90s. And then it was just kind of like off to the races. So because I kind of overwrote this story, my editor probably wanted to like strangle me because it was so long at the time. But that's what ended up catching the eye of an editor at Simon and Schuster, and that's what got me the book.
Wow. Well, I can see why you think it's a scam, though. Everything's a scam nowadays, especially too.
I mean, you just don't expect it because I'm sitting there,
true. If it's too good to be true, it usually is, type of thing.
Exactly. And it's like for me, someone that I grew up, I'm a lifelong wrestling fan, and it's it's something that's meant a whole lot to me. Just as a human being, like I feel like wrestling has been kind of there in my life through like kind of the ups and downs and the hard times and the good times. And to have someone ask if I want to write a book about it, I mean, it's like, what? I mean, it's gonna be a lot of work, but I mean, yeah, obviously I'm gonna write a book. I'm gonna write a book. I've always, I mean, writing a book was always kind of like something I thought about doing. I'm a writer, and I figured down the road at some point I'd write a book. But I didn't think I'd be doing it like in the middle of being a beat reporter, like covering the UFC. I didn't think that was in the cards. But
it's like,
I guess I pulled it off.
It's like one of those scenarios you never expect to just get a call and like, hey, here's an opportunity, something that you'd love to do, of course. Like, what? Hell yeah, let's do it.
100%. And I guess
speaking of the situation, NWO situation, do you recall like where you were at the exact moment when Bash at the Beach happened and this whole turn and Hogan showed up for this?
Yeah, I mean, I remember watching it at home in New York, and I remember the next day. It was July, so school was out. So I was in like a day camp, and I was 11, and I went to the day camp, and I remember everyone was talking about Hulk Hogan turning heel, and it's crazy because there was no internet really at that time, right? So it isn't like people were getting the notification on their phone saying, hey, Hulk Hogan turned heel last night or whatever, like with John Cena's heel turn a few months ago, where everyone knew about it because of social media. But it was so big that even without the internet, just through word of mouth, like people calling people on the phone, that actually happened back in the day, by the way. People actually called people on the phone and said, hey, this is going on. And I do remember, man, everyone at that camp was talking about Hulk Hogan. Oh my God, Hulk Hogan is bad now. What is going on? It was like, I remember that vividly. And there are very few things that I remember when I was 11 years old vividly, but that is absolutely one of them.
Kyle, do you recall at all?
So
slightly younger.
I saw it, like I said, first thing I saw was WWF. So I saw that after I kind of got into wrestling. The funny thing is, now that I've become the utter wrestling nerd that I've become at this point, I've watched all the stuff with all that stuff. And then to hear like when you find out like the little things like how Hogan knocked out the ref so they couldn't count 1, 2, 3 for the match, and just like the little shit that goes through it. But it's like, man, I just remember seeing all the trash thrown into the ring for that, dude. Like I'm like, damn. As a kid, I'm watching this like, damn, they really don't like these.
It was definitely one of those, like, there's only a handful of moments in wrestling that like are the shift in like the cultural wrestling watch. You know what I mean? And this was definitely up there. I mean, because I remember I went to the basketball court.
Jump ship like that.
I was playing basketball in the summer, and I showed up, and that's all everybody was talking about. And it shocked me because I thought I was the wrestling nerd. I didn't know everybody else knew about this stuff. So I'm like, hell yeah, dude, Hulk Hogan, this, and this. I was more pissed that they messed up Macho Man and Sting and everybody, but it is what it is. But yeah, that kind of brings everybody together. Wrestling does that for people, and it just gave us all something to talk about and bond over. But yeah, cosmic shift in the wrestling world right there, dude.
Dude, speaking of a cosmic shift, that brings me into another question I had, because if it would have shifted the other way, who the hell knows where we would have ended up? Both of you guys go ahead and answer, but Mark, what are your thoughts? How do you think things would have played out if Vince would have listened and Hogan would have got to try to have his heel run beating the shit out of the Warrior after WrestleMania 6? What do you think the wrestling landscape would look like?
It's so hard to even figure out what that would look like, because does that even make sense at that point for him to turn heel? Maybe it did. Maybe it did in 90 to turn him heel. I think that,
he had done most of what he could do as a babyface, at least.
Absolutely, absolutely. But on the other hand, and this was also conversations that were going on in '96 when he did ultimately decide to turn heel. Was, hey, what about the merchandise? What about the Make a Wish kids? You know, what about all these things, all these movie roles that maybe you don't get if you're the bad guy, right? And those were all legitimate concerns for him in '96, and they probably would have even been more intense in '90 if that were the case. I mean, remember in '95, Bischoff goes to Hogan's house and pitches him the idea of, hey, why don't we turn you heel? Because everyone knew at that point that Hulkamania was kind of drying up, and you know it was a decade long, right? And the '90s were so different, and everyone knew Hulkamania was on its last leg. So Bischoff, he knew immediately. '95 goes down to Hogan's house in Tampa and is like, hey, what if we turn you heel? And Hogan basically kicked him out of his house. He was like, you got to walk a mile in my shoes, brother, in my boots. And that was it. And that was it. But Hogan even knew then, and Jimmy Hart told me this too when I spoke to him for the book, that Hogan even knew then in his heart that something needed to change, that it couldn't be the same as it had been. And ultimately he pulled the trigger, and it was the right time. But if you're asking me what would have happened if he had done that earlier, man, who is to say? The crazy thing about wrestling is that like the domino effect is real, right? It's like everything kind of exists because of what happened in the past, because wrestling is just kind of like this long running like story. You know, all these characters are kind of related to each other going back decades and decades and decades. You know, there's so much lore there. So it's like if Hogan turns you know, what is that movie with like the butterfly effect? You know, Hogan turns heel in '90, and then all of a sudden everything in the future changes.
Yeah.
That, you know, maybe we're not even here right now talking, you know, probably.
Yep. Well, I mean, who knows if WCW would have survived, dude? If you really think about it, the NWO, I was going to say,
because I mean, if Hogan does this years before, you don't get obviously the cultural shock.
Well, sure, you wouldn't get the NWO, but I'm saying, what do you? I guess
I don't think the NWO would have even flourished the way it is if it wasn't for Hogan. Like, it had to be Hogan.
I agree.
It had to be. There was nobody better. If it was Sting, don't think it would have worked. I just don't think it would have worked. It was such a cultural shock to the wrestling, like to the wrestling world. That was the hero. That was like the turn of the page. Like, yeah, your heroes can be bad guys. And it actually looked cool. And it was honestly, it made all the kids want to be like the cool bad guy. You know what I mean? It just made total sense. It was, as they say, written in the stars of the wrestling world. I don't think it could have worked out any differently at all.
Not wrong, dude. And that leads into one of the questions we got from people leading into this book. You talked a little bit about your research for doing this book and all those things and talking to people like Jimmy Hart. Who were some of the people that you talked to in your research for this? And like, what was your kind of strategy to kind of either gather your information, or where were you getting your stuff for the book for this one?
So when I told you the story about being in the hotel room in Houston when I got the email. So I obviously I wanted to do the book, but I did not feel comfortable moving forward until I spoke to Eric Bischoff, and that was the first person that I was like, yeah. I need to interview Eric Bischoff for this book. Otherwise, there really is no book. So I reached out to him through his team, and I actually met with him in Jacksonville, Florida, the weekend of AEW Double or Nothing in 2021. That was Memorial Day weekend. So it was really just a few weeks after I got that email, and I sat down with Bischoff, and it was a very brief meeting. And you know, basically, I told him, and he had a little bit of an idea of who I was. I think I interviewed him before for ESPN, but you know, I explained to him what I was doing, and I told him, look, I don't know if I can do this book without your help. And he was like, whatever you need, you know, whatever you need, just let me know. And he completely followed through on that, because a couple of years later, actually in 2023, I flew up to his home in Cody, Wyoming. I sat down with him for hours and hours and hours at his home. We had breakfast together. We went to his place, and we spoke. I met his wife, and they could not have been more gracious and cordial to me. And I mean, I think I interviewed him for like 7 hours total, and that's a long time to interview anyone, right? And I asked him everything that anyone could possibly want to know about the NWO, and you know, he was right there for it, and I really can't thank him enough for that. But again, it's like, I don't know if I could do that book without him. And I interviewed almost 100 people in total. I'm talking about, you know, producers and associate producers and camera people and engineers, and obviously a lot of wrestlers, but also I expanded that into, you know, people that were not in WCW, but people who could speak to kind of the cultural shift and the cultural impact. So I interviewed like a presidential candidate. I've interviewed, you know, sociologists, college professors, pop culture experts, people that could kind of put into context what wrestling has done to influence society. I mean, that's the subtitle. How did it change America? I had to talk to some people about how it changed America too.
Dude, that's a crazy thing too, especially growing up and watching it, but then to have to like go get some of these stories. You know, I just saw Eric Bischoff at home here in Detroit a couple weeks ago. He happens to be a past guest of the show. Shout out to him and Bruce Pritchard for sitting down with us. But dude, that's as funny a place as any to go with it. I mean, talking about you know, who you talk to for the book. Who did you talk to that you had something come up that just you never knew or like shocked you or kind of caught you out of left field? And who was it from?
Wow, that's a really good question. Well, the most out of left field interview that I did was so I managed to, because in '98, of course, we remember that there was the Robin Malone stuff, there was the Jay Leno stuff, you know, with Hogan and Road Wilds, and I tracked down the producer of the Tonight Show from the '90s. His name is Gary Constantine. I tracked him down, found his number, gave him a call, and he was very agreeable. And I spoke to him, and he was very helpful about, you know, how all that came together. And at the end of the call, I was just like, "Hey, man, I don't know if you're still close with Jay Leno, but if you are, if you could just pass along my number and say that I'm trying to track him down for an interview for this book, I would be grateful." And he was like, "Yeah, I'll shoot him a message, or I'll give him a call." And I didn't think anything of it past that, right? Because that's, you know, whatever. It's Jay Leno. And then a few days later, I get a call on my cell phone. It's from an unknown number, and I pick it up, and you could hear who it is immediately. That's distinctive voice,
Shit.
and it was Jay Leno, and I just could not believe it. I was like, "Oh shit!" Like Jay Leno called me, like, what the hell? And that was a crazy one. But probably, it's so hard to say who my favorite interview was, but I'll tell you one of my favorites, and I don't think he's done a lot of interviews at all over the years, is a guy that you may not know his name, but you know all the stuff that he's done in the business. His name is Ellis Edwards. You guys know that name?
Mm-mm.
No.
So Ellis Edwards was the stunt coordinator for WCW.
Or wait, nope, never mind. I do remember. I have heard this on Bischoff's talked about it before.
So he was a very hard guy to track down. I came down to Atlanta, which is actually kind of ironic because I live here now, and I didn't live here when I started writing the book. So I came down to Atlanta to interview people and to do some research a few years into doing the book. And he was one of the guys that I wanted to try to get because he doesn't do a lot of interviews. He doesn't talk to a lot of people about this stuff. And I managed to track him down, and I sat down with him, and the detail that he went into about how he did this thing, you know, this thing rappelling down, and some of the other stunts that were involved in WCW at the time. Remember when the Steiner brothers like car flipped over? You know, that whole thing. I mean, he was actually in the car. It wasn't the Steiners. He was like the stunt, the crash dummy in the car when that happened, when it flipped over. It really flipped. He was really in it when it flipped over. He's really was really an important guy behind the scenes in WCW because he was able to create these very real moments out of, you know, stunts. And he went on after WCW closed, and he was Vince McMahon's stunt coordinator in WWF for many years after that. So a lot of the stuff that you saw like in the 2000s, even into the 2010s, was him. Like a lot of the stunts, it was all Ellis Edwards, and he was just a fountain of information about some of the stuff that I didn't know about. How he pulled off some of the, you know, how he pulled off some of those crazy stunts that looked so real. You know, in '96, that stuff looked freaking real. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, and there was no CGI or AI then, right? It was, he was really doing it.
Yeah.
Dude, and the crazy thing about that is, you know, that's one thing that Bischoff's always talked about with the NWO, like when they had the episode in Panama City where they like ran roughshod and threw Ray like a dart through the fucking window,
Yeah,
and all that stuff, and all the people around there called the cops.
Yeah,
like, you know what I mean? Like, that tells you how hot people were getting in. Did you check out any of the like, because there's so much stuff. Like, I remember I was a real nerd for like I love documentaries and stuff like that. So I've watched a lot of the documentary DVDs, like the Rise and Fall of WCW or Rise and Fall of ECW. Did you read the Death of WCW book or the Guy Evans joint for this?
Both.
Okay.
Before I even thought about writing a book about the NWO, I read those. Like I'm a big wrestling guy, so yeah, I'm reading it. Yeah, I read both those.
That's dope. Yeah,
I'm just watching stuff. Like I got stuff on my left screen over here, just like kind of just stuff from that era, the NWO era, dude. It's so cool to like relive that shit stuff, and like you said, the stuff that you just didn't see happening, like Sting coming from the ceiling. Dude, that was, I just remember being a kid watching that, and that was such an incredible thing to see on TV. Like, it's stuff that was unheard of. They really did change everything, man. It's just,
dude,
it's
watching that back, because I watched 500 hours of WCW for research.
Holy shit.
Watching that back, I was literally thinking to myself, like, how the hell did they get away with doing this stunt every week?
A lot of the stuff, yeah. Like, how did you,
like, this is dangerous. Like every week on national television live, this man is rappelling down from a random place. Like this is crazy. It was crazy then, but it's even crazier now. Thinking that how did they get away with this stuff? Like how did no one step in and say, "Hey, that's dangerous. We shouldn't be doing that."
Like remember the one where he came down and he hooked up DDP
out of the helicopter?
Yeah,
dude,
the helicopter one was crazy. Yeah,
I would not trust anybody to do that. I Sting's legit, but I couldn't trust Sting to come down and just take me up into the ceiling, dude. There's no
DDP. That's actually a story in the book too. I don't want to give too much away, but DDP is afraid of heights.
Yeah,
and but he was willing to do that because it was everyone at that time was trying to have the next hot angle. Have the next hot thing happen to their character, and DDP was one of those guys that he was even though he was afraid of heights, he was down for whatever, and that was a crazy moment.
That's like one of those things we talked about, the snowball effect in wrestling. If you didn't have the NWO, you wouldn't have had the Sting angle you had, dude. Sting was always going to be a legend, but the Crow Sting stemming from this NWO, this situation, incredible story. Arguably still one of the greatest storylines in wrestling. Maybe the finish wasn't that great, but Sting came out of that and it just took him to the next level, a legend to the next level because of the NWO.
It's like I sent you the notes or something, because that was also something.
Is that where you? I don't even know where my phone's at.
I was going to ask you about that. So we all know that Starrcade 97 never really played out the way I think that WCW ultimately wished it would have. Obviously, Sting got the title. We all know that there was kind of like the backstage stuff with Hogan not exactly being too happy about it and things like that too. Talk to me about that though, because the irony of that is, and that'll get me into the Wolfpack, but the irony of this is, what are your thoughts on what we saw at Starrcade 97? And then the irony of the fact that Sting went from being like the quote unquote savior for WCW to then when the Wolfpack comes along, now he's a part of the NWO. So talk to me a little bit about Starrcade 97 and then how that then transitions itself into Sting then joining the NWO.
Yeah, Starrcade 97 was such a bummer because I thoroughly enjoyed WCW in 1997 when I watched it back, and I thought it was really just an excellent year of wrestling, just an excellent year of storytelling, of building characters, of building stakes, and of course nothing was bigger than Hogan versus Sting, and that was supposed to be the big climax, right, of the whole NWO storyline, of Sting's story arc, the whole deal. And of course we know that it wasn't. And I don't think even now anyone really knows exactly what happened at Starrcade 97. I interviewed Nick Patrick, and he has not talked many times about this in the last 30 years almost, and even he doesn't know, because he told me, and this is all in the book, he told me that before the show he sees Bischoff, and Bischoff is like, regular count, no change, not fast, not slow, regular count. And then he sees Sting, and he's like, and Sting is like, fast count, fast count, fast count. And then he sees Hogan, and Hogan is like, slow count, brother, slow count. And then Nick Patrick is there doing like, what am I gonna do? Because Hogan is Hogan, Sting is the franchise of WCW, and Bischoff is his boss. So who do you really who do you lean toward? And it was somewhere in the middle of like a regular count and a fast count, he said. But it really wasn't all that fast of a count. And what people forget about Starrcade 97 is that it was a horrible finish, but they did themselves no favors the next few weeks on Nitro and then Thunder after that, because it got even more convoluted where they had a rematch on Nitro. The show went off the air before the match finished, which only helped to piss people off. You know, you're in this ratings battle, right, with the WWF, with Raw, and you're going off the air before the match ends, and then you don't even show the finish of that match until Thunder premieres a week and a half later. I mean, you are alienating the fans that you worked so hard to cultivate for the last, 18 months from when the NWO storyline started. So I think that people forget that the aftermath of Starrcade 97 was just as bad as Starrcade 97. Now, they could have done a better job kind of patching all that stuff up, but they were still saying it was a fast count. I'm watching it, guys, on TV. I'm watching it. It's not a fast count. Anyone watching that, don't piss on my back and tell me it's raining. You know what I mean? Like, and they botched that whole thing. And a lot of it was, by that time, egos were taking over, and the left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing. And it was just very chaotic. And that all led into what you asked me about, Kyle, the Wolfpack stuff. Because in 98, there was a few things that happened in 98 that really split up not just the NWO in storyline, but also in reality. Because when Sean Waltman got fired, Hall and Nash were freaking furious at Bischoff and at Hogan, because to them it was a political play. To Hall and Nash, it was clear to them that Waltman got fired because Bischoff was pretty much saying that he was throwing his support behind Hogan as far as the political machinations backstage. And that pissed them off a lot. They stopped helping out with creative at that point. They were not giving ideas like they used to. Because, I mean, Scott Hall gave Sting the idea for the Crow. And all that stuff stopped after Waltman got fired. And, of course, Hall was also, in 98, he was in rehab. And he was struggling a lot with his own demons. And Hall and Nash and Hogan wanted to freaking kill each other in 98. So the Wolfpack was kind of like almost art imitating life, because there was that real life split between Hogan and Nash. And that's kind of what made the Wolfpack have to be a thing, because Nash was like, I'm sick of this guy. Neither one of them could agree, because I mean, like the heart of the issue between those guys was always like, well, who is the real NWO? Who is the reason why the NWO is so successful? And of course the answer is it's all three of them. You needed all three of those guys to be together. You needed all three of them. There's no NWO without all three, but 2 years into the storyline, egos are taking over, and there's infighting, and Waltman gets fired, and there's political BS going on backstage, and that was kind of what led to the split.
Dude, that leads into another one of the questions I had. We just talked, and that's another thing I think that we've seen kind of like manifest itself in wrestling. If you really look at like some of the more long-term storylines and why eventually they kind of die out, is because when you have a story that goes over that long of a time, you got to keep doing things to progress the story. Like in this case, adding the Wolfpack, and then you had the LWO that came out, and all this other stuff that happens. I mean, you can only put so many different color hats on something before it's.
What about the BWO, bro?
That too. Shout out to Blue Meanie, but it's crazy how all that happens, and then for it to come full circle. I mean, I think even though I gotta say, I'm just saying the Wolfpack had one of the best fucking theme songs in like wrestling history. Because that shit still bangs.
Was legit though too. I mean,
it was, but dude,
it just for me it just sounded like a cool bad guy theme. Like it.
Okay, so this will be a good question, good way to ask about this one. So we also have interviewed Booker T and Stevie Ray both. And they told us when they came on the show that the old Harlem Heat song was just a generic number 5 song that they had at WCW. So, in any of your research, is the same deal with the NWO the case?
100% correct. Yes, it was. It was
same with the logo too.
It was just like literally them going through the Turner music catalog, just like, okay, well, what is this? What is this? and they hear this one, they're like, okay, that sounds like it could be kind of the vibe of the group, and that's just how that was it, and that was it. And they had Eric Bischoff and Craig Leathers listen to it, and that's what got decided as the theme song. Everything was like, like when you think about WWE now and how everything is so polished and planned out and produced, and everything is strategic, and they have it, this was not that in 1996. This was like Bischoff didn't tell anybody about the NWO, the whole idea, because he was afraid that it was going to get out to the dirt sheets, that like Meltzer would have it or something. So he didn't tell anybody about like the storyline. And the first time that anyone like in the marketing department or merchandising department heard NWO was when Hulk Hogan cut that promo at Bash of the Beach, and they were not
He
prepared.
didn't even say New World Order either.
Yeah,
he did the first time, and the second time he said New World Organization. So
That cracks me up every time I see that clip. I'm like, the New World Organization, brother.
So no one knew, obviously when the reaction happened of the fans and Hogan turned heel, obviously, and it was just nuclear, the heat in that building. Then they knew that, okay, we have something here, so we have to figure out how to monetize it. But they didn't know until that moment that this was even coming. They had no there was no plan, there was no prep, it was nothing. WWE, if something like this happens, they have a T-shirt out, ready to go that night. Hey, here's Ron Killing's T-shirt.
I was just about to say they had to take it off of Rhea and shit.
they knew this was not that. This was completely, fly by the seat of your pants. So much so that, and one of my favorite parts of the book is how the logo was made. So when I was, you guys know Neil Pruitt, you're familiar with that name? He was one of the features producers for WCW, and he was very, very instrumental in kind of giving the NWO like their look and their feel through his, like, he was the one who came up with like the black and white, vignettes and that type of stuff. It's his voice doing the following announcement has been paid for by the NWO. Anyway, I sat down with him, in Atlanta, and one of the things that he told me was, and this was back in 2023, early 2023, I came to Atlanta to do research, and he told me, you have to find the woman, or he didn't even say the woman, he had to find the person who designed the logo. And I was like, what do you mean? And he's like, no one has ever found the actual person who put the logo on the computer. And I'm like, how can that be? So then I went to work trying to find out who the heck this person was. And the story basically is that in 96, the Summer Olympics were going on in Atlanta. And WCW did not have the use of any production trucks because they were all being used for the Olympics. So they had to do all of their stuff in Orlando. So right when the NWO was born in Daytona, they were in Orlando doing Nitro at Disney MGM Studios for the next several weeks. So they were not even going back to Atlanta to where like the offices were. So normally stuff like that would have been designed like in-house in Atlanta, like the NWO logo, but they didn't have any access to Atlanta. So they had Disney MGM Studios right there. So what they did was 3 producers went over to Disney MGM Studios. It was Craig Leathers, Rob Wright, and Annette Yother. And they went over and they basically went to a post-production studio that was on the campus, like on the campus of the park. And they went over there and they said, hey, we need a logo and we need it like in an hour. It's like, what? And they were like, okay, well, we have one person here who can do a logo. And no one knew who that person was for almost 30 years until I tracked her down. And it was a crazy, I mean, it's a kind of a long story about how I tracked her down, but basically I found the name of the production studio was called Disney Ideas. And I was able to find the name of someone who was the general manager of that post-production studio at the time. And through her, I was able to kind of like connect the dots and find out who this person was. But even after finding out who it could have been, I still could not find her. It was a woman. And then I found out why I couldn't find her. The reason was because she no longer went by that same name. She got married, so she had a married name. And I was looking for her under her maiden name. So I finally found who she was, and I tried to get a contact for her. I found it, and I just cold texted her one day in 2023, and I was like, you know, hi, I'm Mark. I'm writing a book. Blah 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 blah. I know this is a random question for you, but do you recognize this logo? And I sent her like a JPEG of the NWO logo. And 30 minutes later, I get a text back, and she wrote, yes, I designed it. And I was like, boom, I found her. And no one knew who she was until then. And I interviewed her for the book, and she was very interesting because the first thing that she asked me, guys, she was like, how many t-shirts did they sell? Because she never saw a dime. She never saw a
She
dime.
seems so pissed in everything I've seen when she has showed
That's what
up.
I read.
Like,
Yeah, she was not. I don't want to say that she was upset, but she knows how how these things go. Because even Bischoff didn't make any money off the NWO books.
Shit.
What's that?
I said shit. She should have made something.
Well, I mean, look, she was just doing her job. You know what I mean?
get you.
That was her job. She got paid a salary, and she didn't get any commission on what she designed or what she was doing. And she didn't know. No one knew that was going to turn into this. This logo, this iconic logo that has been. First of all, it's been copied like a million times by every industry in the world. It's like one of the most iconic logos, I would say, in the history of the United States. I'm gonna make that leap. This is one of the most iconic pop culture logos.
I still have
ever.
one of the Wolfpack flags. I still have one of the Wolfpack flags downstairs.
Nice.
But yeah, so that was just how, like, she told me, she was like, they were like, we have an hour and we can't even use color. We gotta just we're on low budget. We gotta get this done because they needed to start making shirts. They needed to start, making money off of this NWO thing because they just were not prepared for it. Another cool thing, and it's not, I know that I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but I found this to be really interesting, is that when the NWO first started and they were actually selling shirts at the arenas, what they would do is they would actually, so you guys have all been to concerts and wrestling shows, and you're walking up to the venue and you see like these guys out on the street selling like bootleg shirts, right? So they actually did that for the NWO shirt to make it seem like they were bootleg. But they were actually WCW affiliated people doing it, but they didn't want anyone to know that. So they actually had guys out on the streets selling NWO like bootleg shirts, but they were actually the real shirts. I thought that was really interesting because they really committed to the idea that the NWO,
somebody's invading them.
Right, that it was a separate organization. So much so that even like when you got sent like the catalog, and because there was no internet, so you got sent the catalog of like the merch. The catalog even had different phone numbers, one for WCW and one for NWO. So if you were calling to get NWO merch, you were talking to a whole different person, even though it was probably the same office.
Right.
But you were talking to a different person. So they really committed to it. And I think that was one of the reasons why it was so successful, because they really committed as an organization holistically to the fact that it was an invasion.
Yeah. Yeah. Remember, Kyle, remember that WCW NWO revenge game?
Fuck yes, I do.
Incredible.
It was WCW and NWO. It was like multi-branded, man.
Just the preview video in that game was the shit where Sting's about to get ran over by the fucking truck.
the first WCW video game with the NWO, they actually it was just gonna be WCW, but then when THQ saw how big the NWO was getting, like in just the summer of #96, they actually put it all on hold and said, okay, we need to actually include the NWO as a big part of this game. So it actually didn't come out as quick as they thought it would, because they were waiting to add all the NWO stuff into it.
Nice. Dude, I played the shit out of those games because, like, for those that have been
blisters on my hands from
the people that have been watching the show. I mean, I grew up as a kid with cerebral palsy, so I had a lot of problems with my motor skills and shit when I was younger. Right, first, I'll never forget the doctor telling my mom to get me a Nintendo. And my mom was like, you think video games are going to help this? And man, I played the shit out of that. I had No Mercy. I had WrestleMania 2000. I had fucking Revenge. I still got a bunch of my Nintendo shit up there. Dude, them were the days, dude. I played the No Mercy storyline so many times, that WCW one so many times, dude. Another thing, you've already brought him up in this, but like, it's crazy that we live in a time where there's a chance that a YouTuber like Logan Paul could be world champion. But if you really think about it, Dennis Rodman and Karl Malone might have been the precursor to all this stuff. And it's just a crazy time to think about because at the time there really weren't that many bigger stars than a Dennis Rodman or a Karl Malone.
I mean, Dennis Rodman was it's hard to really conceptualize how big he was in the late 90s because everything is so different now with the internet and all that. But look, I mean, this is a guy that he was on the Chicago Bulls and he was winning championships with Michael Jordan. And that was probably like the least distinct thing about him, right?
Yeah.
Because he was wearing wedding dresses. He was dating Madonna and Carmen Electra. He was the bad boy of sports. He was the most polarizing person in the sports world. And when he joined the NWO, it was like, this is exact. I mean, it could not have been a better fit because he was kind of already doing that stuff in basketball that the NWO was doing in wrestling. He was an outsider. You know, he was subversive. He was just not a guy that, I mean, Michael Jordan was his teammate, and you couldn't find a more like serious, you know, athlete, sportsman than Michael Jordan. And Dennis Rodman was out there doing the craziest things imaginable, going to gay bars and, you know, causing a ruckus. And he's wearing he's got his blonde hair, or his pink hair, or it's whatever it is. He's got a ton
wearing
of tattoos.
a wedding dress.
Yeah, I mean, just like the weirdest things in the 90s. That was like really like, what is this guy doing? And for him to join the NWO, it just made it massive. And about Logan Paul, I really feel like guys that like social media and what Logan Paul was doing before WWE was already so much like wrestling, because I feel like in this day and age with like the social media influencer and where you're following these people on social media and you're seeing what they do or whatever, it is all pro wrestling to me. It is a persona. Yeah. It is a character.
How
it is
often
not
do we
who they
say
really
this shit?
are. It's not their real life. It is what they're showing you. And to me, there's not a lot of difference between that and what goes on Raw and SmackDown, where it's a character. You maybe using the same name, right? Maybe using the same name, but it is not the same person that is in everyday life. The social media thing is like Logan Paul. It's a persona. It's pro wrestling. It's acting, right? It's content creation, whatever the hell you want to call it. But he's not just being himself. He's created this character for social media, and now he's in WWE doing it. So it's like it's almost, you know, life imitating art, imitating life.
Yeah.
Look, man, I'll say it like
all
this.
the time. Pro wrestling is everything.
Everywhere.
Everywhere
you look.
Dude, it is. And the thing of it that's crazy about it, dude, is like, I'll be the first to admit it. Obviously, with us covering combat sports too, man, like I was not the biggest fan of the shit that Jake Paul and them were doing, especially being a guy that's fought. It just drove me fucking insane. But the one thing I will say is that you can't not respect the grind and the hustle of them dudes. Like, you know, I build yourself all the way up through YouTube, and then shit, even if they're not the biggest name fights, I mean, fuck. Jake Paul just fought Mike Tyson in the damn Dallas Cowboys stadium, whether it's an old Mike Tyson or not, that just made a shit ton of money. And I just, like I said, you can't not respect it. And I've gotten to be at quite a few of Logan Paul's matches at this point. And the things that guy is able to do, people are like, oh, will he practice? Bro, they all practice. If he can get up there during WrestleMania and drop a picture perfect elbow while holding the camera out to film this whole bitch and doing it and still lands it perfect, bro, that takes a level of skill and ability to do that 99% of Americans or humans in general don't have the ability to do. So look, I may not be the biggest fan of them always, but not respect the shit that they do. You can't not, dude. And everybody's complaining about him being around the world title. That'll bring a lot more eyes around WWE, whether people want to admit it or not. So, like I said, it just that was a interesting parallel with where we're at now to like reading through the book, and then I watched the NWO documentary again and like seeing some of those things and kind of how, like we said before, wrestling is kind of like a revolving door, and you know this from being around. I mean, I've been around MMA since 2006, and you know the best fights are the ones where both guys are talking shit and want to kill each other and all those things. But let's face it, if you look down the line, Conor McGregor could talk shit. Floyd Mayweather could talk shit and did pro wrestling. You got, you know, all the different stuff. I mean, dude, we were talking about Clarissa Shields before we came online today. Dude, at the last press conference, we were at Flint City Hall, and you got two heavyweights choking the dog shit out of each other to where they fell off the stage and brought down the whole fucking backdrop and everything. It's pro wrestling, dude.
That's
pro wrestling, dude.
Oh yeah.
You know what I mean?
MMA, I've always said that MMA is pro wrestling, but it ends in a real fight. And
dude, MMA does pro wrestling better than pro wrestling sometimes.
That's what it is. Time. And I also feel like MMA is always better when it has elements of pro wrestling, and I would say that pro wrestling is always better when it has elements of MMA, like that the reality. And,
agreed, 100%.
I actually you brought up Jake Paul and then Logan Paul. I did a story for ESPN a couple years ago with Jake Paul talking about how he has kind of like him and his team have kind of patterned his career kind of like pro wrestling in a way, in the sense that they tried to tell a story about his career from opponent to opponent, the way that like pro wrestling tells a story about like their characters. And I thought that was a very fascinating thing to, first of all, to admit, because people don't like to admit that pro wrestling is involved in real sports, and I understand that. But it's true. If you just look at who have been the biggest stars in the history of the UFC, they've all had some kind of a pro wrestling persona, whether it's Conor McGregor or Ronda Rousey or Brock Lesnar, and those two did WWE for extended periods of time. So if you just look at who have been the big fighters, even in boxing, Muhammad Ali took from Gorgeous George. I mean, that inspired his entire persona. You know, Floyd Mayweather didn't get over as Pretty Boy Floyd. He got over as Money Mayweather when he put on that persona. You know, and Mike Tyson, obviously we know about his involvement in wrestling over the years. First of all, Mike Tyson was a wrestling, like, he loved wrestling as a kid. I mean, he was like a fiend when it came to wrestling in the Northeast, WWF. As a kid growing up in Brooklyn, he absolutely idolized like Bruno Sammartino and guys like that, and he really knows his wrestling. In Mike Tyson, he's like a student of the game. So all of that stuff, so much of the athletes that we watch today, especially in combat sports, have borrowed from wrestling, and it would not be, because combat sports are a spectacle. They're a spectacle as much as they are a sport to me. Mm-hmm. And wrestling is the ultimate spectacle when it comes to that. It just happens to be a fake fight, and those guys do the real fights.
Not to mention, we didn't even talk about the fact that Holyfield's kid's fucking signed by the WWE right now.
Yeah, that's true.
That in and of itself. All right, before I let you get out of here, I got a couple left for you. What do you think ultimately led to the demise of the NWO?
A lot of things. I think definitely the political stuff backstage affected it. I do think that and Eric Bischoff has admitted this, by 1999, he was kind of at his wit's end. He wasn't even coming up with ideas anymore. He was just kind of greenlighting ideas because the lawsuit was going on. There was a merger going on with Turner, of course, and AOL and Time Warner. And there were so many other things that he had to worry about. And he just did not have the creative juices to kind of give to WCW at that time. So I think that was a big part of it. It was just, you know, you could definitely see the deterioration of the creative in real time when you're watching it back. You know, you can see how good 97 was. And then 98, things got not as good. It trailed off. Starting with Starrcade 97, right? It got worse. And then by 99, it's like the finger poke of doom. And it's like, they don't know what at that point they've lost, you know, they've lost the plot, literally, because the NWO was always supposed to be an invasion storyline, taking over. They never took over. I mean, what was that even, right? I mean, that it never happened, but they also never were defeated, right? So they were just kind of there. So they were trying to take over for 3 years or however long it was. The baby faces were not really credible in WCW. Also, outside of Sting, right? They were not credible. And then the Wolfpack came along, and my big gripe with the Wolfpack storyline, guys, is and I loved the Wolfpack as a kid, and I still do. Like you guys said, the music was dope, but what was the thing that made the most sense out of the Wolfpack storyline? You have NWO Hollywood, Hulk Hogan leading the way, right? And then you have the Wolfpack led by Kevin Nash. So as wrestling fans, what is the climax of that story? What is the thing that has to happen for that story to make sense? Tell me.
Somebody's got to go at the end.
Well, Hogan has to face Nash.
We need a payoff from Hogan.
You need a
and Nash,
payoff.
yeah.
Hogan versus Nash, and that never happened because they could
happened.
never get together. You know, they could never get together and come up with a finish or a plan. They were not buddies in '98. They hated each other in '98, and you know, Bret Hart was there. They didn't know what to do with Bret Hart. Bret Hart thinks that Nash and Hogan cut him off at the knees, you know, right from the beginning, from a creative standpoint in meetings, and maybe he's right about that. I don't know if it's so much that, or at that point, WCW creative was so incompetent they couldn't figure out a way to get Bret Hart involved in a meaningful storyline. But also, Hogan versus Bret Hart. How do you never do that? How do you never do that big match? I mean, Bret Hart is the biggest babyface in the world. He just got screwed over for real by your biggest rival, right? You could have stuck it up Vince McMahon's you know what by pushing Bret Hart as the biggest babyface in the world, having him go up against Hogan, right? Man, if you don't want to give Sting the title at Starrcade '97, fix it and have Bret Hart face Hogan at Super Brawl and have him take the title, right? You know what I mean? Like, there were so many ways they could have, you know, and look, hindsight is 20/20, and it was a crazy time. Those guys were on the road so many days of the year. They're drinking, they're doing drugs. You know, Scott Hall's in rehab. He's flipping over rental cars like on the regular. I mean, it's like, it's a chaotic time. So it's easy to kind of sit back here, 30 years later and say, hey, they should have done this. In reality, it was like just trying to keep all that together and do a TV show every Monday was probably hard enough, let alone the actual, the creative.
Well, I mean, the irony of it too, like that was something that stuck out to me in doing research for this too, is like, when Sting joined the cause as part of the Wolfpack, like to me, that almost killed a lot of what the NWO had too. Not that I'm saying, like you said, I like the Wolfpack too, but Sting was supposed to be like the big savior. Mm-hmm. And then for him to come around, and same with when Dusty Rhodes went over there.
Yeah.
You go from these two are like two of the big pillar people for WCW. You got, the WCW, big baby face. And now both of them are there. And, it's funny because it also kind of ties into something that we already talked about and how everything in wrestling is kind of like a revolving door. And and in my opinion, I think one of the big things that led to the demise of the NWO is the same thing that has kind of made Bullet Club. It made and now has made Bullet Club watered down, in that they just had so many fucking people in there. And so many of the people just didn't make sense. Like, it was just like bringing people in to bring people in. And I feel like you said, how the wrestling world kind of like circles itself. I mean, realistically, the Bullet Club's still around in New Japan, but it ain't what it was when, Kenny was involved or when AJ was the leader or any of that stuff. It is not what it used to be. And I feel like that's the same trap that the NWO basically fell into.
It's a completely valid criticism, and I don't disagree whatsoever. But you also have to realize that at that time, they were not thinking of the NWO as just a storyline. They were trying to give the NWO its own separate show and almost make it like its own promotion unto itself. So in late '96, when they started to add, Big Bubba, you know what I mean? Like Ray Traylor and Michael Wall Street and guys like that who really had no business being, in the NWO. They were thinking of it like, okay, we need to fill a show with just NWO guys. So we need some mid-carders. We need some lower card guys. We can't just have a show of just main event guys. Someone's got to take a pin once in a while, right? And it certainly wasn't going to be Hogan or Hall and Nash, right? Right. So at that time, they were thinking of it that way, and they were never kind of able to kind of fix that issue, because by mid '97, I think they realized that there wasn't going to be an NWO show or, a separate NWO promotion, but they never were able to kind of figure out a way to go back and get rid of some of that dead weight. They did lose Ted DiBiase. They got rid of the Giant. Then he came back. It was a whole thing. And then another thing too, and this was a product of the fact that the NWO was so over and the baby faces were not, because they were made to look like geeks. Everyone wanted to be in the NWO. So it was like guys were politicking backstage, like, hey, put me in the NWO, because that was where the money was going to be. That was where the angles were going to be, because if you weren't in the NWO, or one of the main baby faces going up against the NWO, you were nothing. You were nobody. You know, because Bischoff was not really paying attention to the mid card guys. Like Chris Jericho was like doing whatever he wanted. You know, it's like whatever Jericho. Okay, yeah, okay, whatever, Chris, whatever. You know, like, and that's actually what helped him get over. Because Bischoff was so worried about the NWO, he didn't even know what Jericho was doing, and Jericho was out there, you know, with his list of 1,000 and something holds, you know, and they're just like, all right, whatever you want to do on the, you know, whatever you want to do on the undercard, go for it, and he got over that way.
Absolutely,
awesome. That was a good.
I remember that.
Remember when he cut back from commercial and he's still listing the hold?
It's tremendous.
The spitting three-handed family Gradunzel.
And that was, and it's so clear too that was all Jericho himself, because we've now seen Jericho in AEW kind of writing his own stuff, and it's the same type of stuff, you know. It's so that was all Jericho back then.
Hell yeah! Shout out to Jericho. All right, dude. We've covered most things NWO, but I got to get your thoughts because we had quite the interesting weekend in the world of MMA as well. I just wrote a new article on KO3C.com as well as bodyslam.net about my thoughts about what we saw with Kayla Harrison. In a lot of ways, I feel like we're already kind of in a spot to where realistically, if you think about it, number one, what says that this fight between her and Amanda is even going to happen at 135? And to the point that I made in the article, if you really think about it, with the fact that she already beat Ketlin Vieira, who was number 2, she beat Juliana Pena, who was the champion. Realistically, other than fighting maybe one or two others, she's already basically cleared out 135. And I've already been hearing rumblings about how they're talking about maybe having them fight at 145. But then there's the other problem that I brought up in that article, and the fact that 145 doesn't exist in the UFC anymore. So that brings interesting things. So what are your thoughts on Kayla Harrison, and what do we see for Merab? Is Merab the best bantamweight?
Well, the whole Kayla Harrison thing, and that was always going to be the issue with signing her to the UFC. The issue was always going to be, who is she going to fight? Because first of all, it takes a lot to get her down to 135. I mean, I don't even know how she does it, honestly. So I think that her amount of fights at that weight are limited, if not already done, right? So you have the Nunes fight, and obviously you have Pena, but then there's no one else out there of any interest really to fight Kayla Harrison. And that was always going to be the issue that they would have with her, especially if Cyborg is going to be somewhere else. And I don't think she's ever coming back to the UFC. And at this point, you know, she's almost 40, and like, who really wants that anyway, I guess at that point, I don't know. But that was always going to be the issue with bringing in Kayla Harrison. And one of the big issues the UFC has is that the 135-pound division never, you know, we all thought that Ronda Rousey was going to be this pioneer where she was going to pave the way, and then when she left, there was going to be so much talent coming after her, and that just never happened. And I blame the UFC a little bit for that, because I don't know if they've cultivated women's MMA the way they could have, and invested in it the way they could have. And now the cupboard is bare. And it's been pretty bare for a while, and they've been trying to, you know, squeeze as much big fights out of Pena, Nunes, and Harrison as they possibly can. So it's hard to say what is going to happen next. I would love for Kayla Harrison to never be 135 again. I like Kayla Harrison. I still communicate with Kayla. I texted with her a few days ago. We were pretty tight at one point. I don't cover MMA anymore, but I like Kayla Harrison as a human being. I don't want to see her kill herself to go to 135 anymore. I really don't. And you can do that at 145, but like you said, Kyle, there is no 145-pound division, and there's no one coming up. There is no one coming up at 145. There is no future star. There's no one there. There's no one at 135. There's no one.
I was just about to say 135's not really got a whole lot there for that either. And I mean, really, it's the same case with the men.
I've even said, I've had these conversations with people very high up in the UFC about after 125, just call it like women's heavyweight, and just have it be an open weight division the way that men's heavyweight is from, you know, 216 to
then Caleb would kill everybody.
She would. And this was a conversation.
She doesn't have to cut weight at all.
Right. This was a conversation that I had a few years ago where there were, you know, Nunes was still there, Harrison was there, Cyborg was still there. There were these possibilities for fights, but it's unfortunate because she is an incredibly talented fighter, but I don't know if she'll ever get her just due as a fighter, because she just doesn't have any competition. There's really no one out there for her. And then as far as Marab, man, I mean, this guy is just he's just something else. I mean, he is
It's fucking
he's just
psycho.
a beast.
Levels
He's just a
above,
beast. I have a hard time envisioning anyone beating him right now. Everyone has their time, right? No one is going to be unbeatable forever, but it's going to take a lot to get that guy off, off that title, out of that division. I really believe that. I think that he's got a different kind of motor. I think that, now he's, he's finishing guys on the ground. You can see his
I didn't
striking has
expect him to
improved.
submit Sean. That was surprising
Yeah.
to me.
And you can see it, his striking has improved too. It's like, oh boy, this guy is a handful. Like, he is a handful. And I don't know. I mean, if Umar Nurmagomedov improves and wins a couple more fights to get that shot back, he might be the guy that has at least an opportunity to beat Merab. But I don't know. I really don't know right now at 135 who that person is.
I don't think that's happening anytime soon.
It's not apparent. Like, no one out there when I look at the rankings is like, oh, that guy might give Merab a fight. I don't think any of those guys are giving Merab a fight, to be perfectly honest.
I think Umar is probably the most intriguing matchup of them all. I think Corey Sandhagen probably gets the next shot, as I think he should, and I think that one will be an interesting fight. But I'm with you, dude. Merab, and I talk about this on the show all the time. Being somebody that's fought and like being around so many different fighters from, like I've gotten to pretty much most of the people that have come out of Michigan in the last, I don't know how many years that have gone to the UFC, from guys like Miles Jury to Darren Cruikshank to Justin James to like everybody that's come out of here. I've watched these guys go up through the regionals and all those kind of things. And so
even like Jamal Hill, right? Jamal Hill's from
absolutely, he's a past guest of the show as well. Can't wait to see him and get back in the cage here for UFC. Can't not show love to old Sweet Dreams. But my point being, man, it's just like at a certain point, it kind of gets to like, what's the next man up, bro? And you see like the way like the stuff kind of like builds itself. And then there's that one guy like Merab. I'm a big believer in momentum. I say this all the time. If you get a guy who's on a roll and just feeling himself, and then you add to the work ethic like a guy Merab's got, that's going to be a bad motherfucker to put down, dude. Like, I just got to commentate Kevin Lee's last fight outside the UFC before he signed with PFL. It was here in Michigan. And that's another thing. There's levels to this shit. And I feel like the level that Merab is at is just like a little bit above where the rest of 135's at. And realistically, you can say the same with Kayla Harrison. I think bantamweight as a whole in the UFC, you've got the champion, and then there's, kind of like a level in between where the rest of the division sits. So I'm definitely looking forward to seeing where that's at. I'm also looking forward to reading the rest of this book. Mark, anything you want to throw out there, let anybody know. Let them know where they can find the book, and we definitely got to do this again, bro.
100%. You can find the book pretty much anywhere you can find any books. So it's on Amazon. You could find it on Barnes & Noble, Target, Walmart, anywhere you can get books. You're going to find this book. It's on pre-order right now. It'll come out officially June 24th, and then you'll be able to see it like in stores. And honestly, I'm really excited. I want to go to Target, because I go to Target all the time, right? I want to go to Target and see my book. That's like going to be like the biggest thrill for me, is to just be in Target, because that's like, I feel like you can write a book and it can be on Amazon, but it's like, if you want it to be in front of like real American, like just real human beings, normal people, Walmart and Target, right?
I was going to say, don't forget Wally World,
right?
You want, and also for me, to a lot of people that were fans back then in the 90s of the NWO and of the Attitude Era, they are not really watching wrestling now. A good amount of them, right? Because there were 10 million people watching in 99, and now there's like 1 million or 2 million. So a lot of those people are gone. So I don't know how to find those people unless, hey, maybe they're gonna stumble upon the book in Target or Walmart and see, oh man, I remember this. This is incredible. This is like my childhood. I'm excited for that, because I really want to get the book into the hands of those people, because it's a nostalgia trip. The 90s was really a really interesting, fascinating time to write about and study. And I want those people who remember the NWO so fondly the way that I do to find the book. So, but that's my spiel on that. But yeah, anywhere you find your books, I'm on social media at Marc Raimondi on X and at Marc Raimondi Sports on Instagram, and I'm posting a ton of book content. I think my followers probably want to strangle me at this point for all the book promotion that I've been doing. But yeah, pre-order now. Things are going well. We have a shot at New York Times bestseller. We have a shot. I don't know if we'll get there, but I'm hoping, we get those numbers up in the next week and a half or so until the book drops, and we can be the first ever like journalistic book about wrestling on the New York Times bestseller list. Like the first ever book
put
that
out
actually
in the
examines
universe.
wrestling culturally on the New York Times list. That's never happened before.
Well, damn it, it should
we're
be there.
speaking that into business.
Yeah.
NWO,
Don't get
say
much
hello to
bigger
the
than
bad
the
guys.
NWO,
Go
man.
get you
That's
one,
right.
bro. Mark, we
That's
appreciate the time, dude. We definitely got to do this again. Hopefully, I run into you in another city soon. Whether
I'm
you
sure
guys
you
are,
will.
I'm sure we will, dude. If you guys are watching this on Body Slam, we thank you. Millions, we thank you. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit the fucking subscribe button. It helps more than you know. Until the next time, and in between time, I mean, last week we were at a wrestling school. You need to hit subscribe because you never know where the hell I'll end up. Although we do know if we're taking bumps, J-Bone's still too pussy. But that's till next week.
I ain't taking no fucking bump.
I've taken some bumps. You know what? I took a